The morning sun filtered through the oval windows of Gate 42B at LAX, spilling across the polished tiles and restless travelers. Among them was Margaret Hayes, a retired public school teacher in her late 60s, traveling alone for the first time since her husband passed. She clutched her worn leather handbag close, ticket trembling slightly in her hand. Not from age, but apprehension. Her seat was in first class, a birthday surprise from her daughter. Something extravagant, something she never would have bought for herself. The gate agent, sharp in a blue blazer and colder than the steel in her voice, barely glanced at Margaret before printing her boarding pass. Gates open, don't hold the line. There was no "have a nice flight," no smile. Just a dismissive flick of the hand. Margaret shuffled toward the plane, heart thudding, not just from nervousness but from the stare she felt prickling her back. She looked out of place in first class. Her floral dress, slightly faded from years of washes, didn't whisper wealth. Her shoes, practical and scuffed, didn't scream prestige. The glances said it all. You don't belong here. Once inside the plane, the divide was immediate. First class was a quiet cathedral of exclusivity, leather seats, champagne whispers, passengers in tailored clothes staring at iPads or nothing at all. Margaret stood awkwardly in the aisle, ticket trembling as she read the seat number again. 1C, front row. A man in a pinstripe suit sighed loudly behind her, and then, just as she reached her seat and placed her bag overhead, a deep, unmistakable voice came from behind. Calm, low, unbothered. Don't rush her. She's got every right to be here. Margaret turned, startled. It was Samuel L. Jackson. He wore a charcoal knit cap, reading glasses, and a long silver chain with a carved obsidian pendant around his neck. He was dressed like someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, and yet heads turned. Some recognized him instantly, others just felt the shift in atmosphere. Samuel took the seat directly across from Margaret, gave her a reassuring nod, and leaned back, unbothered by the small storm of discomfort still brewing around them. That's when the flight attendant arrived, and the trouble truly began. The flight attendant approached with the exaggerated poise of someone who had long ago confused hospitality with hierarchy. Her name tag read Cynthia, and her smile was polished but hollow, like chrome with no warmth underneath. She scanned the cabin quickly, her eyes narrowing as she clocked Margaret, then Samuel. She paused, looked again at Margaret's ticket, and tilted her head. "Ma'am, I believe you may be in the wrong section," she said, not unkindly, but with the unmistakable lilt of doubt, the way someone might speak to a lost child. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she offered the printed pass. "No, it says 1C. My daughter surprised me." Cynthia barely glanced before cutting her off. "Right, well, okay then." She turned away, but not before raising her eyebrows as if to say, "That's new." Moments later, she circled back with a tray of pre-flight beverages. To the businessman in 1A, orange juice or champagne. To Samuel, "Mr. Jackson, can I offer you something special?" Her tone was suddenly warm, professional, starstruck. He nodded coolly. "Still water's fine." Then came Margaret. Cynthia hesitated, then reached for a plastic cup, filled it halfway with warm tap water from the galley jug and handed it over without eye contact. "Here." Margaret took it with a small puzzled "thank you," but the contrast in treatment had already set the cabin buzzing. And then it happened. As Cynthia leaned over to adjust something on Samuel's side of the armrest, her gaze landed on the necklace. The carved obsidian pendant glinted beneath his shirt, partly visible. "Oh, wow," she said, louder than necessary. "That's dramatic. Is that your celebrity bling, or are you summoning spirits in first class?" A few chuckles sparked in the cabin, mostly from the suited man behind Margaret and a younger woman scrolling through her phone. Samuel didn't smile. He didn't blink. Margaret looked down, as if she had done something wrong by association. Cynthia, still smirking, added, "I guess even necklaces come with an attitude." It was meant to land like a joke, but instead, it thudded, hard and sharp, into the silence that followed. Samuel tilted his head slightly, as if assessing whether the moment was worth responding to, and then he turned. But he didn't speak. Not yet. He just stared, long, cool, deliberate. The flight attendant stepped back, blinking, her smile wobbling slightly. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some looked down. Others watched, sensing something deeper brewing just below the surface. Because Samuel L. Jackson wasn't just wearing a necklace. He was wearing history, and the flight attendant had just mocked more than a piece of jewelry. Tukyo. Quiet that followed Cynthia's comment was not just silence, it was pressure. Invisible but thick, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Samuel sat still, his fingers lightly clasped, the obsidian pendant now resting in full view against his chest. He didn't speak, but his presence sharpened. It was like the cabin had tilted slightly toward him, not because he was famous, but because something in his stillness demanded awareness. Margaret fiddled with the hem of her sleeve, eyes fixed on the safety pamphlet she wasn't reading. She felt exposed, not just by Cynthia's earlier treatment, but by the way others had laughed. Laughed at the man who had defended her. Laughed at something they didn't understand. Samuel finally reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Slowly, methodically, he opened it and placed something next to the pendant on his tray table. A second piece of carved stone. Different. Older. Rawer. The businessman in 1A glanced over, curiosity breaking through his smug detachment. Samuel spoke. Quiet, measured calm. Not to Cynthia, not yet. This one, he said, gesturing to the second stone, was worn by my great-grandfather. He carved it while working 16-hour shifts in a Louisiana foundry. They called it a talisman. I call it a memory. Margaret looked up, her eyes catching his. He nodded to her, as if sharing the moment. Still, he hadn't looked at Cynthia. But she was already unraveling. She stepped forward, trying to reassert herself. Well, I didn't mean to offend, Mr. Jackson. I just thought it was theatrical. Now, Samuel turned. You thought it was entertainment, he said, voice low, but unmistakably sharp. You saw a symbol you didn't recognize, and instead of curiosity, you reached for ridicule. That's not service, that's performance. Passengers now leaned in, phones subtly lifted, some recording, some frozen in place. It wasn't just about a necklace anymore. It was about recognition, dignity, respect. Cynthia straightened. Sir, I was just trying to lighten the mood. He didn't blink. You don't lighten the mood by making someone else carry the weight. The silence deepened again, this time tinged with discomfort, realization, even guilt. Margaret sat, taller now. She didn't smile, but something in her posture said thank you. Samuel placed both stones back into the pouch with reverence, zipped it shut, and leaned back. Not triumphant, just settled. The cabin had changed, so had the flight, and Cynthia, she hadn't said another word since. The plane taxied onto the runway, but the cabin remained frozen in a suspended kind of awareness. Cynthia retreated behind the curtain separating first class from economy, but the heat of Samuel's words lingered like smoke in a closed room. No one spoke, not even the businessman in 1A who now stared fixedly out the window. Samuel's presence had shifted from passive to surgical. Every movement was deliberate, every glance purposeful. He wasn't just another first-class passenger anymore. He had become a question mark slashing through the complacency of the cabin. Midway through the flight, Cynthia returned. Her demeanor had changed. No longer smug, no longer superior. She held a tray of warmed towels like it was an offering. Would anyone care for a refresh? She asked, her voice barely reaching above a whisper. Samuel didn't even look up. He waited until she was directly beside him, then turned his head just enough to speak. Do you know her name? He asked, nodding toward Margaret. Cynthia blinked. Excuse me? Her, the woman you handed warm tap water to, the one you assumed didn't belong here. Do you know her name? No, sir. I wasn't given that information. He nodded once. Because you didn't ask. You assumed. He gestured to Margaret. Her name is Margaret Hayes. She taught for 43 years in a public school system that forgot how to say thank you. She taught my niece, gave her a book that changed her life. You handed her a cup of water like she was an inconvenience. Cynthia's throat moved, but no words came. Samuel leaned in, voice quiet, sharp, enough to cut glass. What you did today isn't about service, it's about power. You used that uniform, that smile, and this aisle to remind her where you thought she belonged. The businessman in 1A now turned fully, attention locked on the confrontation. You mocked something sacred to me, Samuel continued. But that's not even the worst of it. You mocked a stranger for not fitting your idea of first class. And everyone else? He scanned the cabin. They watched. They laughed. Or worse, they said nothing. No one met his gaze. Samuel sat back again, folding his hands. Cynthia, stunned, nodded slightly and whispered, "I'm sorry." He looked at her one last time. "Don't be sorry to me. Be better for the next person who sits here and doesn't look like a hedge fund." Then he turned back to Margaret and asked, "What book did you give my niece?" Margaret blinked, then smiled gently. "To Kill a Mockingbird." She said she'd never read anything that made her feel so seen. Samuel nodded. "She became a civil rights attorney. You planted that seed." The air shifted again, this time toward reverence, a silence of respect, of reckoning. The hours in the air passed slowly now, not because of turbulence or delays, but because the cabin held its breath in the aftermath of something deeper than a confrontation. It was an awakening. Cynthia stayed mostly behind the curtain, emerging only when duty required, each movement stripped of the casual arrogance she once wore like a second skin. Margaret sat more upright now, no longer trying to shrink into her seat. A quiet strength had returned to her posture, like a flower reclaiming sunlight after a storm. Samuel remained composed, but his mind was far from the clouds outside the window. He wasn't thinking about Cynthia anymore. She was just the symptom. The problem was the pattern, and patterns, he knew, were never isolated. After the meal service, as the cabin lights dimmed, a young black flight attendant named Elijah passed, discreetly through the aisle, eyes alert. He paused near Samuel and leaned in slightly. "I saw what happened," he whispered. "Thank you." "That wasn't the first time she's done something like that." Samuel turned to him, his voice calm. "You seen it before?" Elijah nodded. "She makes jokes, quiet ones, always aimed at passengers who don't fit her mold of what first class should look like. It's always subtle, but it's constant. Management brushes it off, says she's got one of the best customer service records on file." Samuel frowned. "Best for who?" Elijah's eyes met his. Exactly, and there it was. A culture that measured good service not by how all were treated, but by how the right people were treated. A system that protected smiles and scores, while letting bias go unchecked behind the veil of professionalism. Samuel sat in silence for a moment, absorbing it all. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small, discreet notebook. He jotted something down: names, times, details. He handed a slip of paper to Elijah. "When this flight lands, call that number. Tell them everything you just told me. You'll be protected." Elijah's eyes widened. "Is that who I think it is?" Samuel nodded. "Civil Rights Accountability Board. My niece helps run it. This isn't just about one flight, this is about fixing something bigger." Elijah looked like he might cry. He didn't, but the weight of the moment settled on him like armor instead of chains. "I just wanted to help people fly safe," he said. "Not feel small." Samuel leaned back again, gaze steady. "Then we make sure no one else does." And in that moment, it became clear. This wasn't just a first-class cabin anymore. It was a courtroom, a stage, a battlefield, and the reckoning had only just begun. The plane landed with the usual thud and lurch, but there was nothing routine about the atmosphere in first class. A weight hung in the air, not of fear, but of consequence. Something had shifted, and the quiet hum of jet engines couldn't drown out the pulse of what was coming. As passengers disembarked, most avoided eye contact with Samuel. Not out of defiance, but shame. Some nodded respectfully. Others whispered apologies they didn't have the courage to say aloud. Cynthia lingered near the exit, trying to look composed, her name badge suddenly feeling heavier than her whole uniform. At the gate, Elijah waited beside Margaret and Samuel, his phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking quietly, but with the resolve of someone who'd been quiet too long. Yeah. Samuel L. Jackson himself. Said you'd know what to do, Elijah said. I've got names, logs, and a few witnesses. By the time Samuel and Margaret reached baggage claim, the wheels were already turning. A tweet had gone viral. A clip recorded quietly from the first-class cabin, just after Cynthia's bling comment, capturing Samuel's precise, calm rebuke. It had over 2 million views by the time they reached the carousel. The caption read, "Samuel L. Jackson just taught a masterclass in dignity. Watch what happens when someone mistakes culture for comedy." By nightfall, the airline's public relations team had scrambled. Their inbox was flooded. Hashtags surged. Respect in the sky, Jackson Justice, not just a seat number. Elijah's report had reached the Civil Rights Accountability Board within hours. What they uncovered was damning. Not only had Cynthia received multiple internal complaints from staff and passengers, but those complaints had been suppressed or quietly discarded by her direct manager, who, it turned out, had once worked with her at another airline with a similar pattern. An emergency review was launched. Press outlets picked up the story. By morning, the airline issued a formal apology, but it wasn't enough. Samuel refused to let it be. He appeared on a morning news segment the next day, not to shame, but to explain, to teach. He didn't name Cynthia publicly, but he spoke about patterns, complicity, and the cost of passive prejudice. This isn't about a necklace, he said. It's about who gets seen and who gets sidelined. It's about how power dresses itself as politeness and hides behind policy. That ends today. By the end of the week, the manager was fired. Cynthia was placed on indefinite suspension, pending investigation. The airline announced a new partnership with the Civil Rights Accountability Board to create mandatory cultural empathy and anti-bias training across all departments, starting with first-class cabin crews. The change was real. The system cracked. And Samuel L. Jackson? He simply said, "Next flight, someone else gets to sit in peace." 2 weeks later, Margaret Hayes sat in her modest living room in Pasadena, sipping tea from the same chipped mug she'd used for years. But something had changed. She wasn't just sipping tea. She was preparing for a call that would tilt her quiet world on its axis. Her landline rang. She answered with the same careful grace she'd taught generations of children. "Ms. Hayes?" "This is Rebecca Lang from the Jackson Foundation for Educational Justice. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Samuel L. Jackson." Margaret's heart fluttered. "We were moved by your story and your decades of service. Mr. Jackson would like to honor you in a way that reflects the impact you've had, not just on his niece, but on countless students across the years." I don't understand," Margaret said softly. "An educational fellowship is being established in your name, the Margaret Hayes First Light Fund. It will provide scholarships to first-generation college students pursuing degrees in education and public service. Samuel has seeded it with $250,000 personally. Additional pledges are already coming in." Margaret couldn't speak. She tried, but her throat closed with emotion. Tears filled her eyes, not of sadness, but of overdue acknowledgement. "That's not all," the woman continued. "Your story inspired dozens of letters from former students. We're compiling them into a book. He'd like to present it to you himself next month, if you're willing." Later that week, a black SUV pulled up to Margaret's modest home. Samuel stepped out, wearing a dark blazer and his ever-present knit cap. In his hands was a leather-bound volume embossed with gold leaf. "To Mrs. Hayes, with love and revolution." He handed it to her at the door with a smile that said more than words could ever hold. Inside the house, they sat together in quiet conversation. Margaret shared old class photos. Samuel shared childhood stories, little anecdotes of how one teacher's kindness had echoed through a family tree. Before leaving, he stood in her garden, small, overgrown, and stubbornly blooming. "You planted more than seeds in that classroom," he said. "You planted futures." And just like that, the act of justice was complete, not just in the courtroom of public opinion, but in the soil of lives changed. Margaret didn't just get an apology, she got a legacy. Spring came early to Pasadena that year, as if nature itself had heard about Margaret Hayes and decided she'd waited long enough for things to bloom. The morning air was softer, brighter. The world felt, in some small but undeniable way, changed. Margaret no longer walked with the quiet stoop of someone trying to take up less space. These days she moved with intention. Graceful, yes, but no longer invisible. People stopped her on the street now. Strangers who had seen the video or read about the scholarship fund. Former students who brought flowers, handwritten letters, or just a warm embrace. "I wouldn't be where I am if not for you," one said. "A nurse. You taught me that my voice mattered." "You made math make sense," said another, a young city councilwoman. "But more than that, you made me feel seen." Margaret started volunteering at a community center not out of necessity but joy. She tutored children after school, sat on an education reform board, and even began writing essays about her years in the classroom, essays that a small publisher expressed interest in compiling. She moved to a slightly larger house, not grand, but sunlit and sturdy, with room for guests and a little garden that reminded her of her late husband. The move was made possible not by pity, but by the speaking engagements she was invited to, the advisory positions she accepted, and the financial recognition that should have come long ago. The Margaret Hayes First Light Fund grew steadily, bolstered by donations, partnerships, and Samuel's continued support. Dozens of young people were now walking across graduation stages wearing sashes with her name stitched into the fabric. But Margaret's greatest transformation wasn't material. It was internal. She had spent decades pouring light into others, never expecting it to be returned. Now, it surrounded her. One afternoon, she received a framed letter from Samuel. It was short, handwritten, and powerful. "You didn't just teach kids. You taught a world that forgot how to honor its elders. Now the world remembers. And it remembers your name." It hung in her hallway beside the framed certificate of the foundation. Guests always paused there. Some asked about the man who wrote it. She always smiled. "He's not just a movie star," she'd say. "He's a witness to injustice, a witness to transformation, and in the end, a witness to the quiet, steadfast power of a life well lived." The stage was modest, just a podium, a microphone, and a backdrop bearing the logo of the First Light Fund. But the hall was full. Students, teachers, journalists, and everyday citizens packed the rows. Some stood in the back, some leaned against the walls, but all were silent as Samuel L. Jackson stepped into the light. He wore no suit, just a dark turtleneck, a black blazer, and the obsidian pendant around his neck. It caught the light for a moment, then settled back against his chest like a heartbeat. He began slowly, deliberately. "I wasn't supposed to be on that flight. It was a scheduling accident, or maybe something else." The crowd chuckled lightly, but he didn't smile. "That morning I watched a woman, someone who had given her whole life to others, be treated like furniture, disposable, unseen. Why? Because she didn't wear wealth, because she carried humility instead of status." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Let me be clear. This wasn't just about one flight attendant. It wasn't even about me. This was about how easy it's become to mock what we don't understand, to belittle those we think don't belong, and to forget the power of quiet dignity." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. He continued, voice calm but steely. "We love to celebrate heroes once they're gone. We write tributes, build statues, name schools, but we forget to honor them while they're still here, alive, breathing, walking past us with groceries, riding the bus, sitting alone in a classroom. Margaret Hayes is one of those heroes, and there are thousands like her. He stepped from behind the podium, walking slowly toward the edge of the stage. If we're serious about justice, we don't wait for funerals to show respect. We give people their flowers while they can still smell them. Applause began, first soft, then thunderous. He raised his hand for quiet, and when the room settled, he delivered the line that would echo across headlines, social media, and memory. Respect doesn't cost a damn thing, but withholding it, that cost is passed down for generations. And with that, he stepped back, gave a single nod, and exited the stage, not like a man who had just spoken a speech, but like a man who had lived every word of it. The crowd stood, clapping not just for him but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, diminished, or overlooked. And in that moment, a room full of strangers remembered something simple but powerful. Kindness is not weakness, and dignity is a birthright. The video of Samuel's speech at the First Light Fund Gala spread faster than expected. Overnight, it became more than a moment. It became a movement. Teachers across the country posted clips of their own classroom stories under the hashtag #GiantFlowersNow. Airline employees shared their experiences, good and bad, and unions began quietly drafting new guidelines for bias accountability. But the most powerful responses didn't come from influencers or networks. They came from everyday people. A janitor in Detroit wrote, "I used to feel invisible at work. Not anymore. I watched that flight video 10 times. Mr. Jackson spoke to my soul." A 16-year-old girl in Atlanta. "I never thought I could be a teacher until I saw people fight to protect one." An elderly man in Chicago. "My wife passed 2 years ago. She was a teacher too. I watched that speech and cried." Someone finally said what she always believed: dignity is a right, not a reward. Meanwhile, Margaret's life continued with purpose and peace. Her garden grew fuller, her days brighter. The scholarship fund flourished beyond expectations, and every letter she received, every young face she saw enter a classroom thanks to her name, watered the roots of something far greater than her pain. At a reunion hosted by the foundation, a young woman in a cap and gown approached her. She was one of the first Margaret Hayes scholars. "Ms. Hayes," she said softly, "I'll be teaching 3rd grade next fall, and I've already ordered a bookshelf just like yours. The one with the brass lamp. I'm going to fill it with hope." Margaret smiled, eyes misting. "Then you're already doing it right." And Samuel? He remained quietly involved, never seeking praise, just ensuring the wheels stayed turning. He declined awards, redirected honorariums into the fund, and told every news outlet the same thing: "This ain't about me. It's about the Margarets of the world finally being seen." The story, their story, didn't end with applause or a headline. It ended where all great stories do, with a legacy, not carved in stone, but planted in people. And as long as someone, somewhere, chooses to speak up when silence is easier, or to lift someone who's been pushed down, the spirit of that flight, that moment, and that necklace lives on. You never know who you're sitting next to, but you can always choose to treat them like they matter. Fade to black.